Welcome to the Stewart Squared Podcast, the spin-off podcast from the Crazy Wisdom Podcast, where what is it, wrapped you into an exploration of the early personal computing history and the rise of the internet, and then the rise of the mobile, and then how that all kind of merges into AI. So welcome again. You've got your coffee, I've got my mate, and we will dive in.
You got your mate, and I honor and respect the tradition of mate. I don't like it.
Yeah, it's an acquired taste for sure.
Yeah.
So early personal computing industry, when did CRMs, customer relationship management, did that come in right after Lotus Notes? Actually, yeah, let's start with Lotus Notes, the spreadsheet.
Yeah.
I know you've told this to me before, but I've now forgotten. Why did spreadsheets, why were those things so important?
So you got to get the order of things right. The very first spreadsheet was VisiCalc on an Apple II, and the company that was managing VisiCalc was slow to put it on the IBM PC. So Lotus Development Corp, started by Mitch Kapoor, was the very first spreadsheet on the IBM PC, and it did not just spreadsheet, but it also had two other modes for database and kind of a word processor, all in one program. 1, 2, 3. That was the idea behind it. Lotus 1, 2, 3, and so then Lotus just took off like a rocket because people on the PC are really looking for a spreadsheet, and it was really the first functional spreadsheet.
What were they doing before spreadsheets?
Oh, well, then you're going all the way back. Before spreadsheets, they were, when you were forecasting a business, you'd like do calculator-based calculations to fill each cell of the forecast. Right? So revenue would be this, and each month, and then you'd total it up manually, right? So it's hard to imagine, and really, people didn't really do very good forecasting back then because it was so difficult to do. Because where did the data come from, and how did you, all this manual stuff. Hey, so people really didn't do very good forecasting. It would be an accounting department with a lot of people, with a lot of actual paper spreadsheets.
Wait. So before the spreadsheet, everybody had their calculators, and that was really what technology was. You had a calculator that was helping a human try to do forecasting. And I imagine, based on what you said, the only companies that could afford a large accounting company to be inside of the internal to do forecasting were these large companies. And those guys could do it.
Otherwise, the sole proprietor, you're doing it yourself, and it's like, yeah, it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
And real nerds, the accounting nerds, love the HP calculator, because the HP calculator could actually do strings of calculations and come out with a result. So, but it was like, at the time, this is part of my personal experiences. I started at Inc. magazine in 1981. I think that's what it was. When the personal computer was getting started, and that's when I discovered VisiCalc and the whole thing about personal computers. But we would measure the popularity of articles, right, as a way of telling what we should be writing about that people would actually read. And we would write about computers, and we didn't know anything about computers, so we wrote these really boring articles about, doing general ledger and accounting on computers, and they would get the lowest readership scores of any of the articles. So at one point, I just said, let's skip that. Let's not do that, until I discovered the guys behind VisiCalc. And then when we started writing about the personal computer, the readership scores are really high, because it was a whole different thing. It was like, oh, your computer. And they had this thing called a spreadsheet plus a word processor, and sort of a rudimentary database. And so people could buy their own computer. And what happened was, before the IBM PC was introduced in the fall of 1983, I think it was, the accountants in big companies and in accounting companies would buy an Apple II and bring it to work, because the IT people didn't know what it was. They're all about mainframes and mini computers, and so the Apple II started showing up on people's desks in big companies, and the managers are going like, "What's that?" It was basically a super calculator, and they were using the spreadsheet as a super calculator until they realized they could program the spreadsheet and set it up so that it would do it over and over again, and that became a phenomenon. That's why the sort of pundit of the day, Ben Rosen, had this famous line, well, in the tech business, a famous line where he said the Apple II, VisiCalc was the dog that, God, I got this right, was the tail that wagged the dog. VisiCalc was the tail that wagged the dog, and the dog was the Apple II. And, so Apple itself had to go like, wow, look, people are buying our computers to run the spreadsheet, and we should do more of that. And became buddies with the guys at VisiCalc. But of course, VisiCalc started on the Apple II, and they were totally in the Apple ecosystem. Yeah. IBM showed up; they were slow to respond to it.
So, okay, is Ben Rosen still alive?
I'd have to look it up. I think he might be. I haven't heard that he passed. But he went from being a pundit to getting in the venture capital business.
Before you.
Looks like, yeah, before me. He wrote a newsletter, and the newsletter was Ben Rose. It's going right to Twitter. Why is it doing that?
What was the name of Ben Rosen's newsletter?
I'm
just looking.
Rosen letter, REL.
Yeah.
He after he stopped the newsletter and started venture capital, he turned the newsletter over to Esther Dyson. And Esther Dyson released 1.0, and the REL was capitalized, right? So it embedded Rosen Electronics letter in the name. She started release 1.0, took over Ben Rosen's newsletter the same month that I started. And actually another newsletter, Dick Schaefer's, can't remember what it was called, technology. It's more about investment. So Esther Dyson, Dick Schaefer, and I were the three newsletter writers that all started in like 1983.
And so you really got into it at the beginning when it turned from this thing that IT departments did it, and then new people, personal, autonomous, it's like agency, where it really brought technology and computing to the level of the human and the individual.
Yeah, it was true, right? It was a true phenomenon. Even people bought IBM PCs on their own before the IT department figured it out. But it was IBM, so like it got into IT departments much more easily because IBM was already a computing provider.
Now,
and that's the thing that
yeah.
Microsoft missed, that
yeah.
just a productivity machine, just a programming machine. And that's always what saved Apple, was Apple understood that it was a personal device.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, and this is the brilliance of it. Goes right into AI, and it kind of relates to a question I want to ask you of like, when did programming become a phenomena? Because it has been so interesting for me to live my life and being around you, but not being too interested in what you were doing in the early, just wanting to play video games. You're just like, you were doing these things, and there were parties, and there were important people coming over, and all I wanted to do was play video games, but watching it. And then watching other friends of mine become engineers, become programmers, finding financial freedom, then getting into Bitcoin, then total having like programmers, just every single thing that's happened in the last 30 years, they've benefited from. But back when
here's a paradigm, a way of looking at it. Apple started with devices that were personal devices that people bought themselves. Microsoft started with programmers as customers. So their first product was BASIC.
Okay.
And so then they did BASIC, then they did DOS, then they did the applications. So their whole perspective was formed by their original customers. And it's somewhat true today still, because they're real major successes in major corporations. And what they're doing is interacting with the programmers at major corporations who are building apps and systems. And Apple is still selling to individuals, right? So it's like, this, 45 years later, it's the same, even though there are different people running the companies.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. So they're still selling to programmers inside of large organizations who are building systems.
And their successful products are all based on in the network, right? They have the application bundle that they created. The hell they call it? Microsoft. But they combined the spreadsheet, the database, the PowerPoint, and the
And word
and the
processor.
and Word into
Yeah.
a single product called Microsoft Office. That's right.
Yeah.
That's what they called it. That was brilliant. It just wiped everybody else out,
Yeah.
even to the point where Apple couldn't really even build its own. It did, right? Apple has Keynote and
Yeah, but nobody uses them to the same extent that and this is the craziest thing about Microsoft. It feels like it has a little bit to do with the fact that there's defense applications so that they have the trust of the entire US administrative state. But Slack was this phenomena, and then Microsoft came in and built Teams that combined Slack and video calls, and all of a sudden now all of the large organizations all use Teams because of this relationship that Microsoft has built.
Has this one key advantage, which Google has never been able to surmount, and Apple never even tried, which is that the U.S. intelligence agency and Defense Department says it's safe to use Microsoft, which is
true.
Completely, as no system is more vulnerable than Windows. But once you get the government to say something, they don't go back and try to reevaluate it, right?
Okay.
Google's to get the U.S. Army or Department of Defense to say Google is safe, mainly because servers and it's in the network. This
is a really juicy question I want to ask you, and it goes right into something that is sort of culturally topical. And you invest. So I interviewed a fellow by the name of Nathan Mintz, and a great interview about defensive technology. And he said that Alsop Louis has always been an investor, one of the main investors in defense tech, which is a subset of deep tech or hard tech. And so we can talk about the fact that what you just said is so interesting, because the cultural phenomena around the intelligence agencies, and I'm reading this great book called Chaos, which goes into what happened in the 1960s with a little bit of a tinge of conspiracy theory. But the conspiracy theories look at the intelligence agencies as if they're small. They're small organizations that have a lot of power, but they're large bureaucracies. They're
huge.
Yeah.
The people as spies really have a trouble with this, right? The people are actually doing spying can't figure out how to deal with the bureaucracy. So you read the Jean Le Carré books. There's always this lady, usually an old and not very attractive lady in the basement, who manages developing covers and has all the files and the history of the agents, and knows everything that's going on. And that was the counter bureaucracy. That's how the spies were effective, because they always had this kind of one relationship inside the bureaucracy that they could figure out, understand, and trust, because they go out and risk their lives to spy. It's beginning to change, of course. Now it's all digital. Well, not all digital, but it's getting more.
So can we talk about
going through the history? And as you know, your grandfather worked for the OSS, which is the predecessor for the CIA. So he was a spy during World War II. And your Aunt Buff has written this book called The Daughter of Spies, because when they met, your grandmother and grandfather met in London, and they were both working for intelligence agencies at the time. And so they were both spies.
And that was before the bureaucracy existed. So that was still when the
it didn't even exist. They created out of whole cloth the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, because America had no history of spy agencies. And they learned from the Brits, because the Brits had spy agencies for like 100 years.
Yeah.
And they knew how to do it.
So then the bureaucracy arose. At what point because Alsop Louis invests in companies that sell to the bureaucracy. Is that right?
Not necessarily. That's a very difficult thing to do when you're a startup. So, part of the context here is the guy I chose to be partners with, or that we chose to be partners. Had started Incutel, which was the so-called CIA's venture capital fund, although it was not like any other venture capital fund at the time. And so he'd figured out how to master the bureaucracy, including the difference between the executive branch and the congressional branch, because he intuited wisely that the CIA could not have its own pool of money.
Yeah.
That no one would accept that CIA had a slush fund to invest in startup companies. And so the only money had to come from Congress. And so it had to be authorized by Congress every year, the budget for In-Q-Tel, the amount of money, not how they'd use it. And then In-Q-Tel would serve as a filter between the intelligence agency, including originally CIA, but then included the FBI and NSA and others, and the startup companies, right? So the startup companies actually never talked to the intelligence agencies. In-Q-Tel would be in between. And it was a massive insight that led them to be successful. And now, like there's a story about Palantir, about how In-Q-Tel put $2 million into this massive company that's spying on everybody.
Yeah.
Well, of course, because it's all about funding technologies from the intelligence agencies. It's like, get over it. Anyway, I can go on forever about that because I learned a lot from being partners with Gilman Louis, for those listening, is Alsop Louis. And I learned a lot from him. And not because he told me, he could never tell me anything, but I got to know him so well, I could tell what was going on without asking him.
Yeah.
And sort of like reading the tea leaves or being able to read upside down.
So can we go into the Palantir part? What is Palantir? What did that represent in terms of all these things we've been talking about, the rise of the personal computer? What is Palantir?
So, first of all, the New York Times did it. Maureen Dowd from the New York Times just did an exhaustive article, it's very long, about Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir.
Yeah.
Because their stock's been going up.
Yeah.
People are beginning to notice that the company is growing and profitable and selling stuff to everybody except the people we don't like. And so I just note that. I can send you the link to that. But so Palantir and Gilman worked with, this is part of the kind of unpublished history of Palantir, but Gilman at In-Q-Tel worked with Peter Thiel, the initial founder, to create Palantir. And the whole thesis for Palantir is that you use all of the assets of technology, neural networks, machine learning, now what's now called AI, but it's been there forever.
Yeah.
All of that to keep track of everything that's going on, so you can spot anomalies and figure out when something's not supposed to be happening. And they're really good at it, right? Palantir's they were started. Are they 20 years old? I'd have to go figure that out.
I'll check.
But they've been around for a while now, right? And so in the beginning with Palantir, the big knock against it in the venture capital community is just a services company. It's like they go in and the software for every client, and it'd be different for every client, which was true. But they powered through that. So they had to raise a lot of money to get through that because that's not very profitable, until they had specific products that they could sell that were easy to install and the customers could manage them. So it is basically an AI. It's not one AI, but it's a network of AIs that sits there, listens to everything and is searching out anomalies that would indicate that there's something bad going on. That's a gross oversimplification, but
this gets into very, very interesting territory for me, because I'm trying to figure it out, because we have this bureaucracy. Everybody implies that the bureaucracy is the spies, all the spies that you're referring to that are going and doing these things. But that bureaucracy is a large managerial thing that can't be swayed, that things are kind of being sold to through In-Q-Tel. And then you have Palantir, which is essentially just looking for anomalies in this thing. And I imagine that part of that siphons off into the spy part. But why are people so afraid of this thing? Because it feels like many people mistake the spy thing for like my grandfather going off into France doing spy stuff and think that that's what's going on now. And part of it is there is something there as well. But for the most part, it's this large bureaucracy that somehow interacts with another large bureaucracy at the executive level, and also another large bureaucracy at the congressional level. I don't have a point here. I'm trying to map it out.
Well, I can try. So as you know, the US government is organized in three branches.
Yeah.
The executive branch, the president, he runs everything that is in the executive branch. The commander in chief as well, because he runs the military as part of that. And then you have Congress, which is like this assemblage of two different parts. The Senate is two people from every state, so that every state has some power. And then a House of Representatives, which is based on population but is always 535 people. So each congressperson represents more and more people as the population grows. So there's these two systems interact inside the congressional branch, and then the Supreme Court, which is a check on both.
Yeah.
In theory, right now it's like gotten a little weird.
Yeah.
There's no other country that operates like this. Not the way we do. England and France and a lot of other countries operate in a parliamentary system, which is a whole other thing. So we have these immense bureaucracies. The military itself is three different bureaucracies: the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And then the intelligence agencies, which are not just one, right? There's the NSA, the CIA, the NRO. There's another one in the FBI, which is domestic. And so there's other little bits and pieces of it. And they're all very jealous of each other. They have different cultures, different histories, right? So the CIA comes out of the OSS, the NSA came, right? The ability to listen to everything.
Where did the NSA come from? You cut out there.
Yeah, well, it was split off from the CIA as NSA's fundamental job is to listen to everything.
Yeah,
and know
signals intelligence,
lights and other technologies. NRO is about surveillance. No. Reconnaissance office, something like that. They have a different names. Anyway, so there are all these. So the intelligence community is a bunch of different agencies. The military community is another one. Then you have the executive branch running the government with all the departments, right? Interior, health and safety, the other.
And so to take it back to what we originally started with, which has got me onto this whole fascinating tangent, is that Microsoft in the 1980s basically sold to all of these people for their computing needs. Is that accurate?
They became the new IBM. IBM had been the trusted supplier, but they lost some of that trust because they didn't respond fast enough to the PC and understand what it
meant. Interesting.
So they had these big machines. That's why I have this picture in the Computer History Museum of me eating my words, and the word is mainframe, because I predicted the death of the mainframe and created a big kerfuffle about that. But
that kerfuffle was based on the fact that IBM was not able to ride the wave. Microsoft came in as a new entrant riding this wave, sold to all the defense people. The defense people now trust it on this long time horizon.
Yeah.
And this gets into back into the Nathan, the interview I did with Nathan, which is that he says the enemy is on a 30-day acquisition cycle in terms of the drones. They're testing, manufacturing, learning in the field, and then deploying again on a 30-day cycle, whereas the US is on a 5-year cycle. And so
shorter, but it's really actually more like 10 or 20 years. But you build an aircraft carrier and you stamp out a bunch of them over a period of 20 years. You don't actually change them very much, although nuclear is a big change for aircraft carriers and submarines. And so it's like the time horizon. If he's saying 30 days, it's more than 5 years, really, for the US government.
Yeah.
And what he's referring to is the Ukrainians, who are like desperately trying to compete with this monstrous thing, who doesn't care about throwing soldiers at the problem, and so they're using technology to compete and agility. What they're encouraging Russia is brilliant. It's just like really brilliant.
Say it again.
It's like,
what do you mean?
The Ukrainians have gone across the line into Russia and taken a piece of Russia. And the basic theory being, if they have a piece of Russia, they can negotiate equally with the Russians about them giving up a piece of the Ukraine. and their piece of the Ukraine or whatever. And they're way overmatched, and yet they're doing these things that just like poke the bear. So
It's a Hail Mary. They're in a Hail Mary situation.
Pretty much, but it's being effective this time. And so the Russians will figure it out. They're kind of slow, and this is an absolute race, so it's not relative like we're talking about with IBM. IBM is still a very important company, still a key supplier to the U.S. Major corporations, still kind of on the curve with technology, but they never figured out the personal part of it. I mean, it's a very complex landscape, so I'm oversimplifying, but that.
Well, this is the thing I'm trying to figure out is, and it may be a tangent from the personal computer, but I personally love going into it, is that we have these large bureaucracies, and these large bureaucracies are some of the most inhumane, and I don't mean this in the sense of inhumane like slaughter, although there is that other type of thing. I'm talking about inhumane in the sense that if you're in the bureaucracy, you don't feel like a human. And then we have this new thing that we started about in the 1980s with Apple, which is they look at computation from an individual lens. And then within that individual lens, we've now got this new thing, which is the artificial intelligence, the LLMs, which are a very personal relationship. I have a very personal relationship with this LLM. Like, it's teaching me in ways that I've always wanted to be taught. But it's not a real thing. But it's a personal relationship I've got with this thing. And then what does that mean? Because for me, what that means is that companies are going to become a lot smaller, and they're going to be a lot more nimble, but they exist within this framework of a larger behemoth bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy always falls into that. The company I worked with, Invisible startup, now they are becoming much bigger. They're hiring like crazy. And as soon as you hire, you turn into a large bureaucracy that then turns into Google.
Okay, well, there's a process there that you're referring to, which is, I wrote a little squib that said, I wish my companies would become monopolies and be sued by the Department of Justice. But inherently, that means they're worth billions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
I make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And it's not because I think monopolies are a good thing, and this is a huge debate and kind of a sidetrack, but little companies get bigger, some of them, right? Yeah. Most of them fall by the wayside or get acquired. And then you end up with these very big companies, Apple, Microsoft. Apple and Microsoft are the two original PC companies. They're both worth more than $3 trillion now. So for now, the bureaucracy. Yeah. So there's always generations coming along. Google just, Microsoft, Bill Gates wrote a thing about how he just missed the boat. Yeah. He actually tried not to miss the boat, but he couldn't get his company to react. And Google did search and became a behemoth itself. And, so this goes on. Oracle it was a behemoth, and Mark Benioff worked there, but then he split off and started Salesforce, and Salesforce is now a behemoth. And this is happening in everything, the chips business and all of the services around a lot around chips. And, so it's a process that's always going on. And inherently, most people understand this is a process of renewal. Right. So you have new people thinking new things, doing new things that are meaningful, and they get rewarded by being huge financial successes. And so when you talk about social change and doing not-for-profits, that's kind of the slow way to make it happen. Yeah. But technology is the key thing. Then the companies that affect change get rewarded. Now, it's really interesting in AI because the perception is that Google was plodding along doing AI research, and it was the preeminent center of AI research. They hired all the really cool AI guys, and they're all in there, mostly gone now. But and then this upstart, OpenAI, steps in and goes, "Hey, look, we just released our generative AI chatbot, and boom." Like that, within 30 days, the whole world is focused on generative AI because of what OpenAI. Everybody's going like, what happened to Google? Weren't they supposed to be the guys doing? And so suddenly they're in a mad scramble to try to stay up with this startup, which is now being valued at a significant fraction of Google. And because Google is also, I think, valued at $3 trillion. And this process is going on and it happens every single time. There's like no way to stop it, right? That the startup versus the incumbent. And because when you have 200,000 employees, you can't like get all 200,000 to kind of adopt a new attitude, right? They're all sitting there going, doing their jobs and want to be paid their salaries and they're thinking about their own lives. And but a startup's only a few people and they're all like dedicated to working their butts off until, you know, it works. And so this process of renewals, our advantage, right? They don't have that in China. It has to be, it has to
be state mandated.
To do. It's like, not to mention Russia, where you got Vladimir Putin, who isn't as technically savvy as Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, it remains our advantage, although some people are now in the mode of not trusting anything that anybody does, which is really the key issue. Is you not these big bureaucracies. The US government had an incredibly high level of trust from our population in 1946, and that persisted until the 60s when people started to question whether this stuff happened. Nobody trusts the US government for anything, right? And then, goddamn Supreme Court, you got two guys here who are just like pursuing their own interests rather than defending the Republic. And so we've evolved to this place where nobody trusts anything. You know, it's like you don't trust. Apple probably has, I wonder if there's a survey of what you trust, but Apple's been pounding on privacy and trust for 20 years now. And you know, they're there to help the consumers. So a lot of the reason that Apple has this incredibly powerful customer base is because those customers trust Apple to put them first, right? And to protect their individual interest. So, you know, in the whole AI conversation, it's like Apple kind of already got there first, even though people thought they were late to the game because they were already had this embedded trust from their customers. And, you know, that's like 2 billion or 1.5 billion, so much as many as there are in China.
So this is all very interesting territory. The thing that I felt like there was some skepticism towards from you is that basically I said that this large bureaucracy, maybe it's a personal disgust with being in part of them and interacting with them, that I don't want to do that anymore. And I'm hoping that the rest of the world follows my particular eccentricities.
Let's not make this a therapy session, by the way. But
I didn't mean to. I'm giving you insight into the thinking of this. And was there
millennial, you reflect a common, I won't call it common, a point of view that's shared in your generation
about therapy of everything, basically.
Well, not therapy is everything, but the mistrust of bureaucracies and you know, a desire not to play the game.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
Further, when you go put down further generations, God knows what Ava and Adam are going to be like, particularly with a communist mother. But so you know, the level of trust is generational, right? This is what happened with Biden. Biden is my generation, right? He's only 9 years older than I am, and he was operating the way he'd been operating for 50 years, and it's like he thought that was okay, right? But you know, most of the voters out there now are not my generation. We're no longer the majority. So the younger people are like, what the hell are you defending Israel for when, you know, the Israelis are like killing all these Gazans? Like, what's that about, right? They don't remember Israel's state being created and that whole history. So this happens all the time, right? We used to rule because we were the baby boom. There were 4 million babies a year between 1946 and 1964. And so there was a huge cohort of babies who infiltrated all of the systems of government.
And so do you think that AI will lead to smaller, leaner teams, or will it just be another renewal where large companies will just, that it's a part of a reality that large companies outperform small companies?
Our economic system rewards scale, both in government and in commerce. It just does. It's our system. It's worked pretty well. So it's like, okay. So the inherent value of AI is personal at some level. And because it empowers the individual to be able to see more and understand more. So that will still be organized into big companies economically. And so, there's some concern that, one company will control, like OpenAI, will control all of it. But it's clear now,
Yep.
Claude,
Yeah, there's four of them.
Google search right now is really interesting because Valerie was talking to me about horses, and she said her horse went lame during a thing that she was doing this weekend. And so I thought a horse lame had to be shot. I didn't say that to her, but I looked it up on Google and it told me, no, lame is actually a much lighter term. And, it means that they're having a little trouble with muscles or something like that, which is what's going on with her horse. I can do that, in a couple of 20, I can figure out what she's talking about and inform myself. That's which is not a topic I know anything about, right? I'm not a horse person. And so that empowerment, it is a thread that's coming out of the personal computer industry, but it's much more about the system as a whole. And it goes to, we talked about the Evernet. It's the same thing. Evernet's going to be this huge system, with tens of thousands of satellites in the sky. But the real benefit is I'll be able to ignore the big carriers and cable, all these behemoths.
So how does that not lead to a world where small teams outperform large teams? Like, it feels like everything you just said, the empowerment of the individual, will lead to a place where a small team of maybe less than 150 people, because I run into this thing of anytime you get above 150 people, it introduces coordination costs that make it harder to be more productive. And then
okay. Have you ever read The Mythical Man Month?
No. What does it mean? Yeah.
This is a stable issue, right?
Yeah.
No matter what's going on, what you're talking about is true. And in the 1960s, late 60s, your Uncle Joe would know that intimately. IBM had a product called the System 36, or 36 might have been the one that happened after, and they had something before that. They faced an architectural problem, which was their machines had been designed as these huge systems with software. Software always existed, but people didn't understand it was something separate. So they had to build a new operating system to go with the new machine that they designed. And so their initial attempt was to hire more and more people. They had like 3,000 people working on this operating system, and it just failed. They could not build the operating system because there's too many people involved. Yeah. So the guy, and I think his name is Albert Brooks, but no, that's a comedian. But you can look it up. This guy, they assigned this guy to fix the problem. We've screwed up. We're months behind. We can't figure out how to solve this problem. So put one guy in charge of it, and he came up with the Mythical Man Month, which is the idea that you can measure productivity on a constant basis as it scales. And in software, because a core part of software is being able to communicate with each other, you can't have too many people involved. You have to have small teams. So most software development has since been organized into small teams because, a unit of 8 to 10 people can communicate effectively when they're developing a piece of software, a complicated piece of software. And ironically, Microsoft ran into exactly the same issue with Windows 360, I think it was called. And they were trying to rebuild the operating system from the ground up to do all these different ideal things, which Gates had a vision for, and the effort failed. They couldn't get it out. So they had to have their own guy come in and the history of this is a little vague to my memory now, but you can't effectively, now in the government, which is really interesting, I have to remember the government's not just the federal government in the US, also the state governments and the local governments, and there's a sort of melange. Part of what everybody is talking about, particularly when it comes to weapon systems and militaries, they're like, look at the Ukraine. They're doing all this stuff like on a 30-day cycle.
Yeah.
And the US government is sitting there going like, why can't we do that? Yeah. And there's an embedded bureaucracy that resists change for how processes are run. But there are efforts to streamline the whole process for building new weapons. And I'm sure you've heard of Anduril. Anduril is the company that has scaled so fast to build drone systems and, watchtowers and border control and all this kind of stuff. And they just raised more money, and they're now proposing to build a 5 million square foot mega factory that will build all this stuff. And that may or may not be the right thing to do, but we'll find out. But they can propose products and scale and develop and deliver this product on a much faster basis than the prime contractors can. Covering a lot of ground here.
Yeah, well, so and it's still, you still haven't actually answered my question. I'm very glad you just entered a whole bunch of new threads into that conversation. But essentially, I still don't see how everything we've been talking about doesn't actually lead to smaller teams outcompeting any large team that doesn't have a government protection that's not too big to fail. Like all
even in the government, it really depends on small teams.
Organized in a particular way. Organized in a particular way. That's what you're trying to say, is that the small teams do win out as long as the company itself.
And then you have to coordinate the small teams. It's a management challenge, but and it depends on what it is that teams are doing and how they're collaborating. The CIA is really pretty interesting because it's a huge thing. I don't know how many people work there. Maybe we're not supposed to know, but the 150,000. I don't. I'm just naming a number, and but the CIA went through an incredible transition from being incredibly bureaucratic that had grown up through the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, even the 80s, but then the venture capital technical community started growing up, and people were making a lot more money, not at the CIA, right? So there's only so much where you go like, I'm believe in my country and I'm going to sacrifice myself in order to, further the interests of my country. But shit, they're only paying me $40,000 a year, and the pension sucks. And so, self-interest and broader interests collide at some point. So the CIA has had to figure out how to have really talented people in that organization that are separate and treated differently than the bureaucracy. And so there's always the bureaucratic parts of it, and you have to go deal with them. They'll always be there. The French actually invented the word bureaucrat. Bureau is in French is office, and just people. And bureaucracy is the thing that you have to deal with. Like in India, there's a way of it, and different countries have different ways of dealing with bureaucracy. But you have to have bureaucracy. You can't have the government so unstable that it changes every minute, right? You got to be able to know what.
That's what bureaucracy does. Is it offers stability, a sense of
stability. It everything so that you got kind of a normal. But inside of that bureaucracy, for different reasons, you have to have small teams that do stuff that faster. And in the U.S. government, the whole U.S. government became an incredible slow-moving bureaucracy, and they had no concept of how to be agile, which is the key word. But there is more and more agility, and it's in the states and in the local governments as well. A dawning realization that you can't just sit there and be the bureaucracy. You got to change and go along with your constituents in society. So bureaucracies are inherently inefficient, and you kind of want them to be inefficient.
Yeah. Okay.
It's different if you're really hyper efficient. You're like Microsoft, and you're an aggressive monopolist, or Amazon or others.
Yeah, interesting. It's like the cancer growth. Cancer is essentially a very efficient way of growing that also destroys the host organism, basically. So bureaucracy started in the 16th century. The word itself, but really Napoleon created bureaucratization of a new civil service, and it gets into the 60s again because that was when your generation, maybe a little bit before your generation, said, we're done with it. We're done with the whole thing. Like everything goes away and let's start over again. But they couldn't do it. That's impossible to do.
They weren't part of the incumbents. They weren't incumbents. The only way you can change the system is from inside. And that was the lesson of the 60s. Can't change the system from the outside. You have to change it from the inside. So then all those hippies cut their hair and started getting elected, and
and took over Marin, which I find the funniest part is that Marin is all of the hippies who ended up selling out and making a whole bunch of money, basically, and took over Marin and San Francisco.
Getting their Mercedes-Benz and
Yeah.
hiring a psychologist.
Okay, for the last 5 minutes, what happened in the 1960s? Just like as a, it doesn't need to be about technology, doesn't need to be, I just want to understand your impression of what happened in the 1960s.
60s where my generation lost trust in institutions, right? And that started with the U.S. government and military in particular, but it spread to ultimately where it's kind of a surprise to us, actually, because we still trusted academic institutions and research organizations. But now people don't even trust that. The whole thing that's been going on with the Palestinian protesters on campuses, where the presidents of these huge universities are getting fired because of how they reacted to it. You know, the idea of academic freedom and a university was a protected area where you could think anything you wanted is gone. Well, it's not gone, but there are people trying to restore it. That there's no trust in institutions now, not any trust at all in institutions. That's a really hard thing to solve. And, you know, this is where it comes to my belief that good things only come out of bad things, right? So we're in this really sticky situation right now where nobody trusts anything. So, hey, do people trust Kamala Harris more than Donald Trump? Yeah, maybe because she laughs and, you know, she's kind of more approachable, but not because they trust anything she's actually going to do. And that's just the way things are now. So how do you solve that problem? You know, hope to God it's not a bubonic plague or, you know, or a nuclear war or something. It's just like everybody goes, oh, fuck, it didn't work. So we better go back to believing in our institutions.
Yeah.
True in Israel. I mean, Israel has lost faith in its institutions.
Yeah. It's a worldwide, everywhere in Western civilization, except where I am. This is the only place where people currently trust the government. And it's only
because Belay went in and said, all that stuff hasn't worked. So let's try something new. And they're going along with it and hoping to God it works. It's
it's a total Hail Mary. It's a deepest, darkest of the night type of thing. And it's economically speaking, very, very deep and dark here right now. Like my maid, the
Xi Jinping in communist China actually is pretty stable, and the population is believing in the system, even if they have to pay a price for it.
Well, I meant Argentina is the only place in the Western world where this is where there's trust in institutions. The whole world is something different. And yes, China probably has a lot of trust in their institutions, but the Chinese system is not one I personally want to be living in.
No American would want to live there, right? That's why we don't have anybody like being traitors to the U.S. because nobody wants to live like that. Not here. Yeah.
Okay, really brilliant. I'm very excited about publishing this one. I feel like this was our best podcast. You have nothing to pitch, I guess, because you're not writing anything right now. But
I'm not investing currently, and you know, I'm taking it easy.
Yeah,
I am old.
Okay. Well, we'll see you next week.
Okay.